Mr. Darcy and the Girl Next Door. Written by Alix James. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Prologue. Pemberley, Derbyshire, 1804. With all due respect, Mr. Darcy, what you propose could create difficulties. Mr. Edward Gardner scanned the document presented him by the gentleman once more, his quill hovering over one line in particular. He removed his spectacles and looked across the desk at its owner, a man in his early 50s with greying temples and a grave expression. A single power loom can replace as many as 100 skilled weavers and be operated by a handful of unskilled labourers. Sir, that is— Mr. Darcy sat back in his chair. It will displease the Weavers' Guild. Yes, I know. But there is no help for progress, Gardner. What I want to know is the financial outlay. Well— Gardner shook his head and replaced his spectacles to look over the proposal once more. Your idea is intriguing. You have already secured the backing of other suppliers. Mr. Darcy nodded. Pemberley's flocks alone produce enough wool to meet approximately a quarter the initial demand, according to my figures, and my brother-in-law, Lord Matlock, can produce twice as much. It will be no trouble securing the wool. So you see, Gardner, I can build a woolen mill here on the river, provide a steady income for 50 or 60 families, and a secure future for Pemberley. Or I can sit back and watch another do it. One who, I might add, may have fewer scruples than I. Mr. Gardner nodded slowly as he touched his quill over each line. It appears you are right. I see nothing wrong with your estimates, but I would like to take this to a friend in London to have him examine it for anything we might have overlooked. Mr. Darcy stood from his desk, signalling the end of the interview. Of course, Gardner. You have always advised me well in matters of business, and I expect no different on this occasion. Mr. Gardner folded the leather portfolio and held his breath. On that matter, sir, I must confess I am giving up my position. He met the gentleman's eyes, then looked down again. I was married last year, sir. Yes, I recall. One of our local beauties. Miss Fairbanks, was it not? Lovely girl. Indeed. Gardner's face glowed with pleasure. With my marriage came certain advantages. I have been operating a small import business on the side for some years, and now I shall be able to expand and purchase my own warehouse. Mr. Darcy's stern features softened. It could not happen to a more deserving man. I am pleased for you, Gardner, but I do hope you can refer another financial adviser to me. Fitzwilliam. Just a moment, Gardner. Mr. Darcy stepped from around his desk and extended a hand toward the door. Did you send for them? Gardner turned to see a young man of probably 20, equal in height to the senior Darcy, but lacking the father's commanding presence and ease. Lanky and thin, with a face that looked fresh from the schoolroom. The youth glanced at Gardner before inclining his head to his father. Yes, father. They are in the blue drawing-room. Very good. Darcy looked back to Gardner, his expression growing sombre. I do not believe I have ever introduced you to my son and heir, Fitzwilliam. Fitzwilliam, this is Mr. Gardner from London. The young man required no further introduction. He bowed immediately. Mr. Gardner. Sir. Gardner bowed in reply. Well, Mr. Darcy, I shall be on my way then, and I— Sir, if I may impose on you, there is one other matter which, I am afraid, is more pressing even than the business for which I summoned you. Darcy gave his son a nod, dismissing the young man, and closed the door. "Oh, then I hope I can be of service." "So do I." Darcy sighed heavily. "I have a ward, a young lady who has been in my care since she was little more than a babe. She is now a rather precocious 13. "I did not know that, sir. Perhaps that is the young lady I saw at archery in the gardens when I arrived. She appeared to be besting her companion. I believe it was your younger son." Darcy gave a thin smile. "Yes, Elizabeth Smith. She and my son George are close." "I see, sir." Then his stomach lurched when he realized what the name Smith probably meant. "Oh, I see. You have a problem then, do you?" Darcy's features settled into a scowl. "You would not be the first to assume that, but I assure you that is not the difficulty. She is not my natural daughter, though some claim to see a resemblance, and I am exceedingly fond of her, so much so that I have put off doing what must be done for far too long. However, her presence here is becoming more and more problematic." "What are you asking, sir?" Darcy sighed and gestured for Gardner to follow him. They walked through the long corridors, passing a dozen of Pemberley's servants and as many doors on the way. Finally they stopped before an opened pair of double doors, and Darcy paused. "I doubt they will even notice us." Gardner looked into the room and saw a youth of approximately 15 or 16, lounging on a thick Persian rug and laughing as his companion, the young lady, aimed a grape at his mouth with a catapult made of a spoon and a spool of thread. "You missed, Lizzie," he crowed. "I win the bet, so it's my turn to He broke off with a series of coughs. The girl, Elizabeth, shot to her feet, whooping and twirling around. "I got you that time. Don't you know to close your mouth instead of bragging, George? Now I get to pick what we do this afternoon, and I want to play chess." "Chess?" The lad flopped back on the floor with a dramatic sigh. "On a sunny afternoon? I wanted to ride around the lake. You know I can't keep up with you on horseback. You'll get on that fast hunter of yours and scare the wits out of me. But I do love watching you squirm when I make you sit still at the chess table. A deal's a deal, and you lost, George." Mr. Darcy softly drew the doors closed and turned to Gardner. "They are inseparable, that pair." Gardner felt a squeeze in his chest. "And you cannot let the situation become a permanent one. Is that the trouble?" Darcy tilted his head with raised brows and beckoned Gardner back to his study. Once inside, he drew out a thick portfolio from his desk. "You have guessed the situation rightly. Had she been born on the right side of the blanket, nothing would make me prouder than to accept Elizabeth as my daughter-in-law. She is clever, cheerful, of good character, and would make an able partner for even the most discerning of men. She also has a trust in her name that will see her established wherever she marries, but it cannot be in certain circles." "I am afraid I do not understand, sir." Darcy opened the portfolio and laid it on the desk. "Her origin is known to only two people, her natural parent and me, and it must remain that way. However, as Elizabeth matures, the family resemblance is becoming too striking to ignore. If she were seen, discovered, introduced to the wrong people, it could be ruinous for more than just her. Do you understand, Gardner?" He shook his head. "I suppose, but what am I to do on the occasion?" "You have advised me for years. I know you to be a man of unimpeachable character, and what's more, your Your status in society would protect her from discovery. You want me to become her guardian? Darcy raised his brows. I would make it worth your while. Well, sir, it is not a matter of the money. I can hardly offer such a young lady a good home just now. I am always gone, and my wife, while she would adore a daughter, is I see. If Mrs. Gardiner is already on scent, and cannot often count on your assistance, it is a deal to ask. Just a moment. Gardiner held up a finger. How old did you say she was? 13 in April. I do have 4 nieces in Hertfordshire. One is 14 and too often alone, for her 3 younger sisters do not share her interests and disposition. It might prove profitable for Jane to have such a girl as Elizabeth come to live with them. Is the situation an honourable one? In every way. My brother-in-law, Thomas Bennet, is a gentleman. An idle one, but he is a kind man who, egad, he would like nothing more than to sharpen the young lady's skills at chess. I think the family might suit her, sir. And if you are prepared to, assist, I will add something to the dowries of Bennet's other daughters, if he can provide a kind and loving home for Elizabeth. I cannot see any harm befall her, Gardiner. If Bennet does take her in, I will still view her well-being as my personal responsibility, he vowed. Darcy nodded wearily. Good. For there is another concern. He placed a hand over his heart and heaved a low sigh. My doctor fears that one more bad spell such as I had last winter could turn very grave indeed. I cannot lay this responsibility on Fitzwilliam. He does not know the truth, nor does he have the heart to do what I must to protect them all. Pray, Gardiner, will you look after her? I must have your word. Edward Gardiner cast an eye over the documents Darcy had spread before him, but he never read the contents. He just swallowed and nodded. I will look after her like a father, sir, or, he chuckled, at least a very protective uncle. Chapter 1. Darcy, Derbyshire, 1811. Darcy, you must understand. I do wish to support you in this matter, but it is delicate. My uncle, the Earl of Matlock, paced my study with his hands clasped behind his back. The labourers have employed violence to reach their ends. One cannot lightly endorse that. I laced my fingers together on the desk. Indeed, but would any have heeded them otherwise? There's no other method of redress. I do not condone violence at the mill any more than you do, but I do believe men such as we have a duty to see fair laws enacted. I would not have Parliament descending upon my door in 10 years' time, demanding untenable measures simply because we did not act sooner and more rationally. What do you intend to do? Tear out the power looms, or pay them all 100 times what they're worth? I did not say I had a solution. My father had that mill built on the river with the hope of providing work to families. He saw this great shift coming long before it did. Families forced from the farms to the cities, where there is dismal housing, poor availability of food. He was hoping that a mill in the country could prevent some of those youths from having to remove to Manchester. Aye, and he did not account for the trouble of getting enough labour to keep it running. He did, but he was thinking of a time in the future when the population will be more abundant here, of building something bigger than just the woolen mill. Matlock scoffed, shaking his head as he wandered to the window to peer out. Preposterous, Darcy. What would you do, try to house and employ an entire town? I lifted my shoulders. if needs be. He saw that as a possible end. But why? I never understood this. Oh, I supported him as I support you, but Pemberley is not hard up for money. You have your rents and your investments. Managing this alone is enough to keep a man occupied, so I know you are not bored. Why would you trouble yourself with the business? I pulled back from my desk and rose to my feet, crossing the room to look out the same window. Left to my own devices, I doubt I would have. But my father started this, and I mean to see it carried through. Your father started a great many things, Matlock reminded me. Do you intend to do that with all of them? I crossed my arms and raised my brow. You are speaking of something specific, I believe. My uncle snorted. Do I need to? But perhaps, yes, I will choose something specific. What of George? Do you truly intend to permit him to sail to America and cultivate tobacco? I chortled and shook my head. George has not sufficient ambition for such an endeavour. He only said that to gain attention, and so far it has worked. He has a dozen investors already, willing to back him, and he never even intends to sail. Then why, Darcy? Why would he breed interest in something he has not the inclination to carry through? Because he is George. I sighed and slowly paced the floor, measuring my footsteps by the loops and whirls in the rug design. He has been like that since he was a child, and yet no one has ever checked him. He could say he meant to plant a city on the moon, or toss it all aside to become a wandering cynic, and still he would find people to pledge him their help. It is simply his way. It is a mercy he is at least a man of good principle, else he would be a dangerous rogue indeed. I stopped before the portrait my father had left hanging on the wall of his study, a likeness captured some 15 years earlier, of 3 children and a spaniel dog, and let go a deep sigh. You think he has good principles, do you? I mused softly. My uncle turned to follow me. I never heard otherwise. Has he done something to disgrace the Darcy name? A frown grew on my face, and I shook my head slowly. It is not so much that he has disgraced his name, more that he has done nothing to honour it. I turned around. I will own the truth. I am becoming concerned about his utter lack of direction. First he meant to study the law, then for the church, then he meant to purchase a commission and serve alongside Richard. Yet he has done none of these, but has, in fact, developed a rather unhealthy obsession with racehorses. The only accomplishment he can name is that he has more friends than he can even recall. Not friends of any distinction, Matlock pointed out. Dandies and fops, every one of them. Not all. He is rather close friends with some young viscounts, as I said, dandies, men who have too much wealth and not enough to do. You are sounding rather like my father. I chuckled as I wandered to the astrolabe, my eyes flicking over the polished brass lines. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of quality and engineering. But I had no earthly use for the thing, and sadly it was rather like my brother, splendid and impressive to look upon, but absolutely worthless. If I sound like George Darcy Senior, it is perhaps because I admired his character. We looked up to him, every one of us. He managed to produce one son after his own likeness, but the second, a wastrel and a cad who will spend his inheritance before he has even found a wife. I fingered a wheel on the astrolabe, my brow furrowed, then turned back to my uncle. On that point, I mean to carry my way. I have informed him that he must find some suitable employment for himself before the end of the year. I will not suffer him to become a drunk and a gamester. I care not what it is, so long as it forces him to act like a man of 23, and not a youth of 3 and 10. And how do you mean to force him to do that? He is of age now, and you do not control his inheritance. I crossed my arms. I have my means. Perhaps you would rather not know them. Matlock studied me with a quizzical look. Then he shook his head. Indeed, perhaps not. Well, Darcy, what do you wish me to do about this letter you are writing? I can present it to a few under-secretaries, perhaps garner some support for your way of thinking. Lord Belmont. His jaw dropped. You... what? You heard me. I would present my findings and opinions directly to the man who has the power to do something. Is he not head of the committee? Well, yes, but Belmont, I might as well ask for an audience with His Highness. That would do as well, I suppose. You are serious? I am asking. You can refuse, and so can he, but nothing is to be gained without venturing the attempt. Matlock frowned, his mouth working into an unhappy scowl. Very well. Draft your letter, and I will do all in my power to see it presented to Lord Belmont. Thank you, Uncle. Chapter 2. Darcy. Fitzwilliam, there you are. Egad, man, it is 8 in the evening, and here you are in your study. Do you ever stop working? I lifted my eyes from the crop estimates my steward had presented me earlier in the day, and sat back in my chair. Do you ever start? My younger brother sauntered toward me, shaking his finger with a knowing grin. Oh, testy this evening, are we? Very well, perhaps I shall not introduce my friend to you. He is waiting in the drawing-room, but I can just as easily send him away. I dipped my quill in the ink-pot, and made a note beside one line, then cleaned the quill and put it away. I was meticulous and not fast, mostly because it drove George mad to watch me moving so slowly. Good heavens, man! It is a bloody good thing you employ men to do the hard work around here, or nothing would ever get done. I raised my brow as I put my ink away. Yes, what a mercy I have a man to cut wood, and another to muck out the stables. It leaves me all that time to sit at my desk. Are you coming? He demanded. Because Bingley is going to drink all my Scotch while I am away. My Scotch, I corrected. And I told Huxley you were not to serve my best spirits to your guests any longer. Oh, ho, ho! He wagged a knowing finger at me. It just so happens I did buy this bottle. It was when we were in Edinburgh on holiday. Got a bloody good price, too. Language, George, I admonished. I wasn't sure why I bothered. It never did George any material good, and it made me sound like a tired old courtier trying to parent a full-grown man. I rose from my desk and straightened my jacket. Very well. Let me to this Bingley fellow you insist on me meeting. George's face blossomed. About jolly time. Gad's teeth, Fitzwilliam. You have ink on your fingers like some common clerk. I do not. But I twitched just to make sure. I had, after all, been writing all evening. Got you? George laughed. Come, brother, you must smile a little when you meet my friend. He is not used to bold and commanding figures such as yours. You will frighten him off. I shot my brother a sideways glance. If he is a friend of yours, perhaps he deserves to be frightened off. Ah, very good. I see your sense of humour has returned. I say, Fitzwilliam, you are become rather dusty, spending all your days in the study. It will do you good to meet my friend. I sighed. Very well. How did you meet this one? Did he pay your gambling debts at the racetrack, or did you meet him in town while trying to decide which gold watch fob to purchase? Neither. He is a very respectable chap I met in school. Oh, so you do remember the place. That is encouraging. I remember a fat lot of rules, but with some sport mixed in for good measure. You will like Bingley. He's not like Howard or Bixby, son of a steel mill tycoon who— I thought you said he was respectable. He can carry on a real conversation, which is more than I can say for some men of my acquaintance. Come, Fitz, smile a bit. Here we are. I fidgeted with my fingers as the footman opened the door. There were many things I would rather do than meet another of George's friends. Shaving my eyeball or going for a dip in the icy North Atlantic seemed intriguing. I spared my brother a glance as he waltzed into the room and made his presentation with a flourish. Fitzwilliam Darcy, my friend Charles Bingley of Sheffield. Bingley, my brother. Bingley was a pleasant enough chap, I dare say. He did look perfectly respectable, and he lacked the overly polished look I had come to expect of George's friends, which I thought promising. He did not smell as if he had bathed in milk and champagne, and I even detected a few hairs on his buckskin breeches from my pointer, Wellington. That meant he must have patted my dog, and any man willing, and able, to win Wellington's approval could not be all bad. I smiled tightly and inclined my head. A pleasure, Mr. Bingley. The pleasure is all mine. Join us for a round, will you? George beckoned, reaching for a glass. Bingley has just returned from America. Have you not, Bingley? Oh, indeed. Were you there on business or pleasure? I let George pour my glass and took a sip, and nearly gagged. So that was why George said he got a good price on the bottle. It might as well be turpentine. I swallowed, but the ghastly stuff burned all the way down and rumbled about my innards like a firebrand. Business, Bingley answered. An ironworks in Pennsylvania. The fellow paid me a preposterous sum to look over his smelting process and help him make some refinements. My family's mill. He blinked and broke off, clearing his throat. Well, that is probably of no interest to you. Quite the contrary, I assured him. But will you excuse me for a moment? I rang the bell for Huxley, and when he appeared I went to the door to speak in a low voice. Bring us a proper bottle of Scotch, will you? Yes, sir. Huxley disappeared, and I returned to George and Bingley. Forgive me, you were saying something about your steel mill. Bingley's face flushed. Well, I suppose it might not seem very genteel to you. My father raised me as a gentleman, but he also desired that I should understand the steel industry. Our mill, in particular, has perfected a process that yields high-quality cutlery. Cutlery? Bingley shifted his feet, glanced at his glass, then George, and finally back at me. Yes, more, economical than silver, do you see? Yes, quite. Here is Huxley. I went to the sideboard as my butler presented my best aged Campbelltown. Thank you, Huxley. Yes, a fresh glass, if you please. I glanced over my shoulder at George and Bingley, both trying not to look like they were watching me. I sighed. And 2 more fresh glasses. Rather shortly we were all suited with full glasses of my best Scotch, and I pretended not to notice the smug look on my brother's face. Once again, he had charmed me out of a bottle, but I was rather more interested in listening to what Bingley had to say than scowling at George. The chap was clever, rather too modest, and I wondered how George had stumbled into his acquaintance, but I found him no punishment to speak with for a quarter hour. Perhaps George had accidentally found a friend who could speak of something more serious than hunting-hounds and racehorses. Elizabeth. We were all wedged around Uncle Gardiner's dining table, a scene reminiscent of a crowded market stall rather than a family dinner. I sat, half listening to Kitty and Lydia's animated chatter about their day's conquests in Uncle Gardiner's warehouse, and half wondering if it were possible to die of boredom induced by excessive talk of ribbons and hats. Jane was the picture of polite interest, but I knew her well enough to catch the glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Unfortunately, it was not Lydia and Kitty who were the subjects of her amusement, but me, with the way my eyes were rolling and my head kept bobbing as I tried to keep from nodding off. Uncle Gardiner was pouring out what looked like his third glass of wine, a wise man, fortifying himself for the evening ahead. "Oh, Mamma, the ribbons!" Kitty squealed, nearly knocking over her water-glass in her excitement. "Such colours! You would have thought we were in Paris. I'd no idea Uncle had so many new types of trim." "And the fabrics, Mamma," Lydia chimed in. "I found the silk that would make even a duchess green with envy. I told Lizzie it would look perfectly dashing on her, but she would not purchase any, so I took all of it." I couldn't help but chuckle. I do hope the Duchesses of London can sleep tonight, knowing the Bennet sisters are on the loose. Mamma was nearly trembling with excitement. "Mr. Bennet, did you hear? My good brother has been so kind. Why, each of the girls has new fabric to make winter gowns. For you know they are grown so tall, most especially my Lydia. And he gave them each an allowance to find lace and ribbons. Our girls are always the belles of Meryton, you know, but now even Mrs. Long will be forced to admit there is nothing to my girls." Papa, who had been trying to hide behind his newspaper, peered over with a look of feigned horror. "My dear, if you insist on discussing ribbons and lace any further, I may have to seek refuge in the library with a more sedate companion, like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire." I smirked. "I am sure Gibbon's empire declined due to a severe shortage of ribbons, Papa." "No, as I recall correctly, one of the chief reasons for Rome's decline was overspending." Papa shot a significant glance at Mamma before sipping his wine. "I thought it was due to invasions," Uncle Gardiner mused, scratching his chin. "The Huns and the Goths, was it not?" Papa cleared his throat. "Ah, and speaking of invasion, I had a most interesting rumour before we left Longbourn. It seems that Meryton has been deemed a likely town to house winter training for the militia. Open fields not far from London, you see." Mamma's mouth dropped in a gasp, but then she stiffened and shook her head. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, how you tease me! You see, do you, what I put up with?" she lamented to Aunt Gardiner. "He is forever trying to get a rise out of me, but I say I will not have it. No, indeed, I shall not be baited into excitement over something 6 months away that no one can even tell for certain. Everyone knows I am the model of patience, and he is trying to upset me." "Indeed, my dear, for I like nothing better than to hear and see you in a perpetual state of agitation." Papa sipped his wine, raised his brows, and saluted my uncle with his glass. "An excellent vintage." "You approve?" Uncle Gardiner asked. "I only just had it brought in from a little winery in Kent. It is nothing to the French wines, of course, but more than passable. The weather is favourable for growing, and the distance easy, which saves a great deal on the cost, of course." "Yes, you see, brother, that is precisely what I have been saying. The weather is fine, and it is an easy journey. I have been telling him he ought to take us sea-bathing, but will he listen?" "My dear, you mistake my refusal to go to Kent for failure to listen. Be assured I have indeed heard you. I simply choose not to exert myself to the journey." He sipped a little more wine. "And expose myself to ridicule," he mumbled under his breath. "What ridicule? Only if you do not take us, Mr. Bennet. Your daughter's health. Sea bathing is essential this year to withstand the heat and bring the blush to their cheeks. Why, all the fine ladies partake. Think of their complexions." "I dare say their complexions already spark envy, my dear. Shall we risk a county-wide scandal?" Ignoring him, Mamma turned to Aunt Gardner. "Sister, you see the benefits, do you not? A change of air? There is nothing to it. Why, you ought to come with us." Aunt Gardner held up a hand, shaking her head. "I am afraid I cannot. We are off to Lambton next week, actually." "Lambton?" My head snapped up, and my heart fluttered against my ribs. I had not heard the name of that dear town in years, and I gazed at her as if she had just cracked my soul open. Aunt and uncle both glanced at me, then shared a look. "Yes, Lizzie, I had a letter from my sister Helen. She married Mr. Westing of Farthingdale 3 years ago, and she is in need of some assistance." She glanced at uncle again. "We intend to travel on Wednesday. Your uncle shall return directly, but I may remain until autumn." I swallowed. And where is Farthingdale exactly?" She thinned her lips and sighed. "About 3 miles from Lambton, just north of the old Turnditch Road." My stomach twisted, and my breath caught. "That is not far from Pemberley." "Elizabeth," Uncle warned. He said no more, but the shake of his head was enough to still the words of denial I saw simmering on Aunt's lips. She did not wish to say them any more than he did, but they appeared to be unanimous in their opinion. I should not be asking about Derbyshire or Lambton or Pemberley. "Come, come, Lizzie, you look as if you would ask to go along," Papa scoffed. "What of all the officers I just mentioned? Should you not prefer to set your cap somewhere closer to home?" I bristled. "I am not thinking of setting my cap for anyone. It is only that I have not seen the Peaks district since I was almost too young to remember it. And perhaps I could be of some help, Aunt. Did you not say your sister had a young daughter already?" She hesitated. "Anne Rose is too, but she already has a nurse." My shoulders sagged. "Please, Aunt." "It is not a holiday, Elizabeth," Uncle Gardner added. "There will be precious little time for pleasure, and no entertainment for you." "Entertainment? I offered to help, Aunt. Surely there is something I can do, and if we brought Jane as well," I offered archly. "You needn't be at any pains to exert yourself for my amusement. We know how to make ourselves useful and discreet, do we not, Jane?" Jane's eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair. "Oh, Lizzie, I do not know. To invite myself, I cannot." She shook her head. Aunt sighed and gave Uncle a long look. "To be quite truthful, Helen did say that Anne Rose's nurse wished to travel to see her mother. Apparently she is ill. Helen agreed, so as long as the nurse returned before the new baby arrived, I suppose—" She levelled a cautious look at me. Her mouth quirked into a frown. "You two could be very helpful, if Helen agrees, my dear." Uncle Gardner wiped his mouth and raised a brow at me. "Lizzie, you may well find things very different to what you recall. Things are never quite the same as we remember in our childhood." I leaned forward with a grin. "Uncle, I am counting on it." He sighed and frowned, then turned to Mamma and Papa. "Well?" Papa shook his head. "If they prefer the rocks and trees of Derbyshire to the officers of Meryton, what am I to do on the occasion?" Mamma gasped and swatted at him with her handkerchief. "How you tease me, Mr. Bennet! Did you not hear the name Farthingdale? Why, with such a fine name, surely there will be good company, and perhaps even single gentlemen in the area. And if not, they will be home well in time to meet these officers you claim are coming to Hertfordshire." I sat back in my chair and smiled at Aunt. She rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Very well, Lizzie. You have got your wish. I will write to my sister."